The Grow a Group Practice podcast is part of the Practice of the Practice Network, a network of podcasts to help you grow, manage, and promote your business and yourself. To hear the other podcasts, like the Practice of the Practice podcast, go to practiceofthepractice.com/network. You're listening to the Grow a Group Practice podcast, a podcast focused on helping people start, grow, and scale a group practice. Each week, you'll hear topics that are relevant to group practice owners. I'm Andrew Burdett, a practice owner, and I love to hear from people, their stories, and real-life experiences. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Grow a Group Practice podcast. I am Joe Sanok, your host, helping out for this season. Also, if you want even more content, we have the Practice of the Practice podcast, where we cover everything private practice as well. This podcast obviously is specific to growing a group practice and really enjoy doing this also. We are sharing with you some of our favorite episodes during this season. So thankful that you're tuning in with us today.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Grow a Group Practice podcast. Today I'm here with Sarah Vosen and Cait Donovan. We're both co-pilots at Fried the Burnout podcast. Both are burnout coaches and acupuncturists and have an interesting kind of, background story in short about how they kind of started school together, and 20 years later, they're still doing something different. So with that, can you both introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what you do for a living and kind of how you all have continued to have this intertwined path for working with burnout specifically?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Cait and I started acupuncture school together, and we had a uncanny similarity to how we approached school, which was everything was easy for us, and we were like, go, 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 do, do, do. We weren't afraid to needle people. We were super into it. We wanted to do the best job at making everyone better immediately, and we kind of stood out and were our own group. So it was really interesting because after a couple of years of school, I moved away. She ended up in Europe. Our paths diverged, and we still each burnt out. And I didn't know about my burnout though until Cait burnt out and healed and created this podcast about it. And once she started talking about burnout, and I was like, and I only tuned in because I was like, what's my friend up to? And then I started listening and I said, oh, shoot, this is me. I'm burnt out too. Now what? So I listened to what she had to say and what her guests had to say, and I started to heal from burnout. And once I healed, Cait invited me on as a coach because, as we all know, many people are burning out these days, especially post or through the pandemic and post-pandemic. So here we are working together again with the same intention to help people heal. I didn't know what the word burnout meant when we met 20 years ago, but I'm glad we are still working together and achieving a common goal to help people feel better.
One of my favorite things about us sharing a space is that Sarah has complete control and runs our entire group coaching systems. Like everything that has anything to do with group coaching, Sarah does. And it's something that she has such a natural talent for. She's been teaching in group settings for a very long time. She has another business called Therapeutics where they do acro yoga teacher training and 5-element training for therapists and practitioners. And so she's been teaching in this group format for such a long time, and it's so natural for her, and it's not natural for me. So having her be able to come into this business and fulfill such a large need in our community is like such a relief for me, because now I know that there's all these other people that can be served that I was never going to get to on my own. So Sarah is one of my burnout protection factors in my business.
That's awesome. It's great when you have this kind of co-pilots. Justina, this is my practice in a lot of ways, is kind of my co-pilot. We very much like support one another in very complementary ways. And she's better at staying grounded and helping me focus on staying grounded. And I'm better at the like logistical business ends, which unwinds me. So it's this nice kind of, hey, by the way, like take a break, and having that kind of thing. Or along the lines of, non-Western modalities, she's very much more of an expert than I am and puts the work in there. So it's cool that you all have a nice, very complementary symbiotic relationship. So for listeners out there that aren't familiar with what burnout is, how would you all define what burnout is and maybe what to watch out for or question, am I burnout?
I think that to start this, we have to simply be in a place where we are giving the actual definition of burnout according to the World Health Organization. Because if we're going to be talking about something, we all need to be talking about the same thing. And because burnout is such a buzz word at the moment, I think a lot of people are talking about it how they want to talk about it. And that's just not giving us enough common ground to move forward together. So the World Health Organization definition came to us May 28th, 2019. And it says that burnout is an occupational hazard that has three components. The first is physical and emotional exhaustion. The second is cynicism and depersonalization. And the third is a feeling of lack of productivity or lack of impact/meaning. So those three components all have to be present at the same time for us to say that a situation is burnout. But it's not in the, I was just going to say the DMV.
The DSM.
The DSM.
It's probably not at the DMV either. Not in their
I mean,
lexicon.
it probably is at the DMV, but not in the way I'm thinking right now. It's not in the DSM, right? We're not actually diagnosing it because it's an occupational hazard.
So as a mental health practitioner, I would probably, if I were diagnosing that, I would probably just put something in like adjustment disorder, which means there's external stressors causing distress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You might add in like a depression or anxiety in there because most people that have burnout, people that have a tendency toward anxiety in life normally will have exacerbated anxiety during burnout. People that have a tendency toward depression when they're burnt out will have exacerbated depressive symptoms. Sarah, what would you add to this?
Well, tendency to codependency is
That's a
big
great
one.
phrase. Tendency to codependency. All right.
I mean, that's putting it lightly.
And so I guess with that, like codependent with what?
Others. I mean, many of the people we specifically deal with are people who want to be helpers and healers, guides, therapists, people who want to save the world. And when you want to save others and save the world, but you don't have realistic expectations for yourself and what's possible, especially if you're one person or a small group of people, that is a huge burnout risk factor, because then you'll give and give and give and give and give and never turn any of that giving back on yourself in order to fill up, in order to keep giving.
And your codependency relies on making the people around you satisfied. And your emotional state is, I mean, we know what codependency is, right? Like your emotional state is practically irrelevant because you're just making sure that if the people around you are happy and satisfied, then that means you are allowed to be happy and satisfied. So there is this depersonalization portion of burnout is sort of built into your system because you're not showing up in a way that acknowledges the fact that you are your own individual human who has their own individual emotional experience. So that's definitely a huge part of the like what makes you vulnerable to burnout long term.
It's like a runaway caretaking role.
Yes.
Which as a group owner, and I think a lot of the people listening to this podcast, we all have a degree of we really want to take care of our team. So it's easy when stuff gets funky to like do what we can to kind of step in and maybe like save a bit. And that's something to definitely pay attention to.
It is something to pay attention to. And if you're worried about burnout in your team, the things that you want to look out for are personality changes. So this tendency towards cynicism in burnout is massive. So if you have somebody who was typically a little happy-go-lucky and a positive Polly, and all of a sudden they're complaining more, they're a little passive aggressive, they're mentioning how much they're doing, they're mentioning how busy they are, all of these kinds of things. These are massive red flags for burnout in your teams. And what you have to be really careful of is that once one person starts doing that, it spreads. Burnout is more contagious than COVID.
That makes sense. I can think of different environments I worked on a long time ago in previous fields, and you get the like, the water cooler talk where everyone shows up and it's just like everything's terrible and it just the cynicism feeds off itself. And it sounds like, y'all are talking the same thing in the whole burnout sense.
Exactly.
Right. It's a I don't know, it's a slippery slope and a fine line, because it's important to acknowledge your feelings, right? And validate what you're going through. But if there isn't any if a solution isn't in sight, if there's no hope for change, it's quite the snowball.
So in there, part of what I'm hearing is there's a sense of helplessness that kind of tracks in there too, of this idea or this loss of I'm in the tunnel, but there's no end in sight.
Absolutely. Despair is a big, looming symptom.
Dread and despair.
Dread and despair is, and hopelessness. And
So since most of probably who's listening to this podcast is a mental health person, and we tend to be pretty neurotic about, is it this, is it this, is it this? And we symptom track because we do a fair amount of that with our clients. What if I'm concerned about somebody on my staff, right? And so I'm picking up on this, everything's terrible, it's not manageable all of a sudden, and there's that cynicism there. How do I go about differentiating, not that I'm diagnosing my staff, but in terms of trying to like assess, is this a mood shift that's more permanent, or is this something that's maybe occupational in nature? Like, what are some ways I can kind of maybe address my staff to kind of help find out where they're at and see if it's something that's maybe on my end? I know one of the things that just happened recently was the big giant insurance breakdown with Change Healthcare and all of that. And you're nodding your head, so clearly you're aware of that too, where half the claims for the whole country just stopped coming through. And my different business owner friends have handled that differently, and my different staff or different clinicians among them have handled that separately or differently too. So how does one go about kind of maybe having a conversation that's casual and friendly and not crossing any lines about how are you feeling about things? What can I do to maybe support? Is it this kind of thing? Is it attributable to some external thing, or are you just miserable because something else changed?
Well, I think you have to start the conversation pretty frankly, especially being in a mental health setting. Hey, this is what I've noticed. There's been a shift that I've noticed. It makes me concerned for you, not for my business, not for this makes me concerned about you. I'm worried about you. Is there something going on at home? You don't need to tell me what it is. You don't need to disclose it, of course, but is there something going on at home that's affecting this, or are there other adjustments that we need to make here that will make you more comfortable? Now, someone who's burnt out might not be able to answer this question, because often when you're burnt out, you don't know what you need. So you might not get the answer today, but you might get the answer in a month when they're like, oh God, they asked me that question, and now I finally feel like I can tell them about it. So it might be something that needs to be approached multiple times before someone is like knows what's going on. I have had many people in the past say, hey, listen, I heard about this podcast. I'm wondering if it might be helpful, and then share it. And then, hey, oh, by the way, I listened, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes it just, you do have to have a fairly frank conversation. And if you are, there's a line between it just being stress and being burnout. And that line is really clear. The line is either you can recover or you cannot. So burnout, you could sleep for a week and still feel exactly the same. If you're just stressed and you're having a worse week, you have a long weekend or you take a vacation, you come back, you're refreshed, you're ready to go. Burnout, you do the same thing, you do not come back refreshed and ready to go. So maybe your suggestion is, hey, maybe it's time for you to take your PTO and then see how they are when they come back. And then maybe address it again.
That's interesting because I know last year I burned out pretty hard for a lot of different reasons, but in starting to really get serious about addressing it, that's also how I came upon your awesome podcast. There we go, get my words to work again. Yeah, and your little like Cait bits of little nuggets of things, the practical skill stuff versus the in-depth talk about stuff, extra helpful. But my primary care, when she was asking about it, had a little bit different thing. She's like, if you go on a vacation and while you're on vacation, you were able to kind of like feel better, and then you come back and then you're re-entering that stressful environment. So you kind of, all your stress response comes back online when you get back in the environment that you're stressed about. Is that on the right track, or was she maybe a little off?
Sarah?
That's a good question. I think it could be different for different people depending on what level of burnout they're at, right? So someone might feel better on vacation, and then when they come back to the stressful environment and they crash again, they may even feel that more dramatically because they had this blip of feeling better. It would be more noticeable from the outside, I think.
But I think this is a much lesser form of burnout, because I've never met somebody that was burnt out that could go away for a week-long vacation and felt better when they were on vacation. You just don't feel better. That's the point.
Or it then points to, oh, I am okay, just not at work. So it very much pinpoints something at work needs to change in order for me to feel better.
And
But
if
they
I
may
stay
not,
at this job,
then I'm going to fully burn out in all areas of life.
Got it. So both of you have kind of mentioned levels of burnout. So you do want to maybe talk a little bit about the spectrum of burnout, because there's slightly crispy, and then there's like charred to a crisp, done, unrecoverable, unrecognizable level of burnout. So can you kind of maybe walk through different levels of that? And I'm making up my own terms here. Let me just, for the audience, I'm sure these people have different terms for that too. So those are just
we
my,
like yours.
okay.
I tend to think about burnout being similar to a wildfire in nature. And in order to burn out, you need a certain kind of perfect storm of circumstances in order to burn out, but also a wildfire needs that in order to really turn into a big bad wildfire, right? And I won't go into all those factors, but most people really only start to pay attention to the fact that they might be burnt out when they're like 5 alarm fire, right?
Mhm.
Like many trees are on fire, acreage is being burned, right? Like all these alarm bells are going off for the person, and they're anxious, they're frazzled, their mind can't stop racing, sort of like a fire inside your body, right? It's just like you feel out of control, you can't stop. You're running on adrenaline. You're exhausted on one level, but you're so wired that there's no way you can sleep. Okay? If that kind of level of wildfire keeps burning in your body for long enough, the fuel gets burned up completely, right? The fire eats all of the trees. The forest burns to a crisp, to a pile of ashes, and now there's no more fuel to burn. So this is when you're in the phase of burnout that you feel like a pile of ashes. You are exhausted no matter what. You feel like you have no life inside of you. You probably don't even have a spark, right? Because that's what burned out. You are done burning. You can burn no more because you have nothing left to burn. So there's probably more than two phases, but those are the two more dramatic ones that people tend to really pay attention to and go, oh crap, I need help.
There are charts out there that name 12 stages of burnout. And every time I see that chart, it stresses me out because I'm like, well, I'm already burnt out. Like you picture someone who's burnt out, like they do not have the energy to figure out which of these 12 stages applies to them. So it's like there's someone that talks about the 7 different types of rest. You're burnt out and now you're being told that you have to rest 7 different ways. Like this is just too overwhelming. So I think understanding that almost everything exists on a continuum, and stress as it builds up in your body hormonally on the endocrine system and the nervous system will create more drastic changes as time goes on. That's just normal. So we know that chronic stress after a certain period of time starts to diminish your cell count, your volume of your prefrontal cortex, it diminishes your hippocampus, and your amygdala starts to grow. So there are these physiological changes that we know happens. But what we can't measure and what we don't know, because we don't do functional MRIs for people every year of their lives, is how far along in that process are you?
Mhm.
How much have you really lost? What is the real volume change here? So we can't measure those things. So the only way that we can see where someone is in a burnout process is to basically judge how they're coping. So this is one of the differences with one-on-one clients in our business is I work with people who are charred on the floor in the muck, cannot function. And Sarah works with people who are a little bit further along, who have done some of the work, crawled out a little bit, or maybe never got to that super charred place to begin with, but they don't have enough ground underneath them to figure out which pathway is the right pathway. So she helps get them on the right road. So how burnt out you are, that I think there's either 2 gradients or 4,000 gradients, depending on who you're talking to, but it doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is if you rest in a restorative way, does your body replenish itself? Is your body in a state where it can accept nurture and nourishment or not? That's what we really need to know.
Both of you touched on kind of waking up and realizing you're in a forest fire. And and what I'm getting at is this: you were well into the weeds before you realize you're in the weeds with burnout. And it's not simply like, oh, I'm anxious today because a pandemic started or whatever triggered it, right? Like it's this, oh, I'm 6 months in and WTF, right? Like, how
Or
did I
6
get here?
years.
Yes. So are there any signs along the way that leads into that, or is that more the prevention side of things versus like, or you know, is there anything someone can do to kind of maybe like pay attention to some markers so that they don't end up in a full-on forest fire? Maybe it's just starting on the edge.
We've talked about this a lot. Like, can you actually prevent burnout? And the conclusion the two of us have come to is no, because the coping mechanisms, like especially if it's codependency, but perfectionism, there's all sorts of these ways of being that people tend to live that get them to burnout that are unconsciously driving you. And they are so powerful that we do not recognize the signs. So even though there probably are signs and there might be things that get your attention along the way, they do not seem important enough to stop being the way you're being and doing things the way you're doing them until literally your insides are tantruming and you can't get off the floor, or you end up in the hospital, or something very dramatic gets your attention where you go, oh, maybe I can't keep going anymore. Literally cannot keep going anymore. I wish it were different, but for each of us and so many people that we've talked to over the years, people don't stop doing what they're doing unless there's a really, 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 really good reason that slaps them across the face, probably more than once.
And I think it's important to understand that there is a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and later occupational stress and burnout. So understood, this is a therapist group, so everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? This is not, I don't have to explain these things. So because we know that this exists, and because we know that adverse childhood experiences lead to brain development shifts, changes, right? Your brain develops differently when you have that experience. One of the things that has come to my attention over time is that the part of our brain that is responsible for interoception, so our ability to feel into our own bodies and experiences and body needs, etc., our interoception is really naturally quite low, those of us that burn out. So when someone listens to a podcast like this and they're halfway into burnout, they still don't think we're talking about them, because they're like, no, that's not me, that's about other people. And they're not feeling the things because their brain didn't develop in a way that taught them to be present in their own physical and emotional and spiritual and mental lives. So they don't notice the things, they don't feel the things until they are slapping them over the head, because their interoception is not as strong as someone who doesn't have that background. So I think that understanding that it's not anybody's fault that they get there. Your brain developed in a certain way. You created these coping mechanisms, you engaged with them, your body started to fall apart, but you weren't ever taught to pay attention to how your body was doing. You've been tuned into your alcoholic father or your, whatever, your entire life. And that's all you know. So one of the things that people have to do when they're recovering is retrain interoception. The hashtag of the podcast, the unofficial hashtag of the podcast, is pee when you have to pee. Because we literally have to teach people to pay attention to their bladders often enough that they are getting up and using the bathroom when they have to use the bathroom, because most of us don't. Does that make sense?
It does. And, I think some people maybe really didn't. We all develop kind of like peak areas. So maybe you're really good at
Exactly.
math, so you kind of went way in that direction, and then you kind of neglected English because you didn't find it as interesting or whatever it is. So
Mhm.
your writing skills are not up to the same level
Mhm.
as your math skills, and you're talking similar kinds of things about childhood setting up certain patterns of overdevelopment in some areas and vastly underdeveloped other areas. And there's a book, I'm spacing on the author's name, but it's called Can't Even, and it's about
Mhm.
the yeah, you're nodding your head. Like, it's a
Mhm.
great book. I had to listen to that slowly. I'm a big audiobook person. I had to pace that out because it hit really close to home. Um, but just talking about just the impact that external factors have on us, and that there are certain things that we're just kind of stuck. So Anne Helen Peterson's the name of the author. Thank you for that. So the book is Can't Even. It's about millennial burnout and just generational struggles in that context and framework. But um, really speaks to that degree of sense of help, like helplessness too, of just there's nothing I can do about it. So listeners out there, highly recommend it. Just pace yourself, because be kind. Like, it hits
Yeah.
home.
And well, and I think the thing that we want to say about burnout prevention is not like you can't do anything about it, so it's just going to happen. It's just to me, it's more of a please don't judge yourself for being somewhere on this road because it's unlikely that you had the skills to prevent it, and that's not your fault. That's the message, really. And I had somebody say, "Oh, I avoided burnout because my husband told me that my personality was shifting, and so I left my job." And I'm like, right. She's like, and so I recovered on my own. I'm like, no, you didn't recover on your own because you didn't get to burnout. You acknowledged, you accepted that somebody noticed a change in you and you thought, that's valid. I'm going to go do something about it. Most people that end up burnt
Mhm.
out are like, okay, sure. Deal with your own stuff. Like it's just, it's not, it just doesn't happen in our brains the same way.
You're someone with a vision for your practice, for your side hustle, and for your personal journey. But when it comes to establishing your path and how to get to where you want to be with your practice, things get a little messy. You're also someone who'd prefer to go in person instead of to groups and listening to everyone else's story. To me, it sounds like you could benefit from one-on-one consulting with our experienced practice of the practice consultants. From $5.95 a month and up, you can work with a consultant that will give you more direction and practical tried and tested tips matched to you and your goals. For more information, visit practiceofthepractice.com/apply. Again, that's practiceofthepractice.com/apply.
One of the big takeaways from your podcast is you can't do it yourself.
No.
Yeah. And so for me, at least, engaging in acupuncture, among other things, like work with a nutritionist, a lot of body-based stuff. So actually not even like talk therapy, what I do for a living, because you can't think your way out of it. You thought your way into it. That's really it. What you were literally talking about is you thought your way into it, because I thought I could just not go to the bathroom and be fine, and do that for 20 years and have to go to the bathroom excessive at the end of 20 years not going or whatever, right? Weird
Yeah.
analogy there. Sorry, audience. But yeah, you just can't think your way in and out of it. And you also can't do it yourself. There's not, so please don't try and do this yourself. Like, and as you're paying attention to your staff and doing those things, like, I would, at least the kind of leader I am as a business owner, is I value the quality of life my people have that work with me over business, because business is just stuff. You can always get more or less stuff. There's times it's more abundant, less abundant because of external factors, whatever it happens to be. But the business will still be there whether or not the people are in it. And I would rather make sure that people are having a good time or the best experience I can give them to support them. So we've covered kind of some indicator signs of burnout. So when somebody just kind of flips script and changes and shifts and things, as a business owner, um, you all are entrepreneurs. I'm sure you've run into this, because trying to do work life separation with work life balance is an ongoing struggle, I think, is the most accurate way to put it. And there's times where you feel like, cool, I've got this and it's a compartment, I can step away. There's other times where there are no more compartments and everything falls apart. Um, are there things that, as you are conceptualizing or planning to grow your business, to think of or involve other people? I know y'all are a team and really complement one another. as I'm growing my business, it gets more complicated because each relationship has its own dynamics. And then there's the collective experience of things. So any thoughts or perspective to other business owners that are growing a team of people and how to like factor that in?
Yeah. So I was, freshly recovered from burnout, or on my way to being fully recovered from burnout. And I was recognizing that, for the 20 years that led me up to burnout, that I was wearing all the hats. I was a solopreneur wearing all the hats, and it was too many hats.
Mhm.
And I was expecting too much of myself, and I couldn't keep doing it, especially coming back into the working world. And I shared that with Cait as my friend. And so one of my suggestions is to delegate and ask for help and work with people who complement you and your strengths. So I was like, I don't want to do the marketing part. And Cait's like, I'll do your marketing part. I need help. Win-win. There are more burnt out people than I can help. Can you help me? And yes, I'll help you doing the marketing part. I stopped doing acupuncture for quite a while, and it was sort of a similar situation. I can't do this alone anymore. And so I joined someone else's practice kind of for the same reason. So I could just do the practitioner part, which is my favorite part, and leave the business ownership to someone else. But if you're already the business owner, think about this for yourself too. What is it that you like to do? What are the ways that you can automate some things maybe that you don't have to do literally yourself, or a human doesn't have to do? And what are the things that you either don't like doing or aren't your strengths that maybe you could delegate to someone else who would enjoy doing them and be a great compliment?
I think the other thing that's really, really important here, and this is something that we've had to continuously unravel and unfold as a partnership between Sarah and I, is that not all of your employees, especially if they are other therapists, are going to work the same way as you. They're going to have a different style than you have. They're going to have a different set of recommendations than you would have. And so having a set of standard operating procedures for the group as a whole is important, but leaving enough space for people to be authentic is a completely different part of the business that absolutely needs space and needs trust. So one of the things that we discovered, I was running a training for other burnout coaches so they could understand how to do this work. And Sarah joins the training just to see what I would say to people. And it was after our second or third session, I think. And she said, "Oh my God, I just realized now that I've been trying to do the one-on-one coaching in the same structure that you do the one-on-one coaching, but I don't like it. I don't like your structure. I don't work that way. That doesn't feel good to me. So now then I'm avoiding doing it because it doesn't feel good to me." So we had to create enough space for her to create her way of doing it, and for me to trust that process, and for her to trust her own process enough to be authentically her instead of trying to be under my practice. Like, that's not the goal. So we have to remember that everybody that joins our practice in some way, shape, or form has an expertise that we are not privy to. We are not their patients. We are not in their experience in that way. So we have to leave enough trust and autonomy. One of the 6 factors in the workplace that creates vulnerability to burnout is a lack of autonomy. So when we try to put people in too much of a box, people in therapy are already put into boxes because of insurance codes and then the DMV. Ha ha ha. Just kidding. So, I hope you didn't skip to this part of the podcast because that would have made no sense, but it was a very funny joke. So there's already boxes that therapists have to put themselves into, many of which they didn't realize were going to exist when they started school for therapy, many of which are a little bit morally against how they want to show up in their rooms, right? So if we allow people to be authentically themselves within the workplace, they will have a much higher burnout protection factor long term.
I was very much nodding. Listeners aren't going to see it, but we're on a video thing, and the what you don't know when you get into the real world as a therapist of I have to diagnose everything if insurance is going to pay for it. That doesn't feel good. This person's just coping with a stressful period of life. Why do I have to give them 5 diagnoses, or just all of the nonsense and insurance is a whole other thing. That was the first thing I outsourced. I realized I couldn't call an insurance company, rage on where's my $10 and then go be a therapist. They can't coexist. So, and I hated doing it. So I will live and die by my biller so long as I take insurance. That'll be the first and last thing that stays around. But yeah, the running into what the struggles of just doing what we do and how to do it in a way that's legal per our licensing boards and expectations for all of the other things. It's horrendous. I'm shifting over to W-2, which means that there's going to be a little more direction about here's kind of how the kitchen works, but I'm kind of leaving it that way. It's like, so at the end of the day, I need a cake or I need it to look like this. So your notes have to be done in this time frame. Here's your template that has everything you need to do in there. I've made it as simple as possible, but the goal for the rest of it's to be as handoff as possible. I don't know how long, depending on how big I get as a group practice, I'll be able to allow what I allow for now, which is if you're going on vacation, like people are next week, I'm like, just let me know if I need to do anything. Send me a note. You are not asking permission to go not be at work. You're an adult. I'm an adult. That's stupid. So please just go on vacation, right? Like if it's, maybe more than a week, let's have a conversation just so I'm aware to make sure this is for you when you come back, just clients, etc. But yeah, trying to just leave in as much freedom and talking with different people about that transition too. They were like, you realize you don't have to change the management style. Everyone can still operate very, very autonomously. But I very much value that because I don't want to be told what to do, which is why I don't work for somebody else either, right? So yeah, I think the autonomy piece is huge.
Yeah. And all the research supports it. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no question about what a factor it makes overall.
I think too, you brought up the importance of trust in terms of making sure people feel that and trusting people to get work at a professional level that they're trained to do and the way that they work to do it to then give you the cakes that you were asking for, because we'll keep it that metaphor, and just know that it's going to get done right in a way that's satisfactory to meet the standards. And then if everybody bakes different cakes because they like different flavors, so be it, right?
Well, and I don't even need to go cakes. If we go with patience, no matter who you are as a practice owner, you are not the right therapist for every patient that walks in your door. I am not the right burnout coach for every single person that calls us from the podcast. Sometimes Sarah's just a better choice than I am. End of story. Because of that person. So if you don't leave space for people to bring their personalities to their work, you are doing a disservice to the patient population at large.
I think that's an important message to group practice owners too, because especially new people in the field, I know I went through this for quite a while of like, I took it really personal when I wasn't a good fit and was trying to like people please to be a fit for everybody. And it burns you out. It doesn't serve them. It's not good. Not to say that you shouldn't have some diversity on your caseload as you're kind of figuring out where your niche is, but at the same time, like to be a full-on generalist, I don't know that that's really helpful for anybody. I don't care how long you've been in
Unless that's your style.
Yeah.
Unless that's totally your style, right? But most people, that's not their style.
Mm-hmm. So key takeaways for business owners, group practice owners in particular, about paying attention to burnout, what to notice for others, what to notice for themselves, and how to best support.
So I think the biggest thing that we haven't spoken about yet is that you are the tone of the culture as the leader. So if the culture is not working for a lot of your people, you are problem number one. As a group practice owner, you should have at all times a therapist, a mentor, or a coach. One of the three. You should not be standing at that helm by yourself. Most people are not natural leaders. You were not taught leadership, most likely. Someone should help you do this well. You are unlikely to do it well without support. And if you end up burnt out, you are going to be patient zero. You are going to be the start of the contagion. And you will shift the culture in your own office without even realizing it. And then all of your therapists will burn out with you. And everyone will not understand what the heck happened. Except for everyone will understand but you, because all of your people will be like, our boss is crazy. So what the most important thing that you need to understand is that your health and wellness and your mental state and your emotional state and your clarity and your alignment are paramount to the success of your business. So make sure that you have people supporting you, maintaining those things so that you can then model and share that support with everyone that you work with.
I'm just sitting with that because this time last year I didn't have a whole support crew, and professionally or personally, like not at the same level. And my group practice owner group of people in Asheville, there's a bunch of us that are all collaborative in nature, want to like raise the floor for everybody, support one another, has been vital to just do that. And we have a group chat, was blown up today because some other people are having some very Mercury retrograde, people bailing, not communicating well, all of that stuff happening. And everyone's like, yeah, that sucks. Let me know if you need anything, and it's great
Yeah.
because, again, without that, you're just on an island on a asteroid way out in space and super isolated, and it's very lonely.
And you don't deserve that.
No, we're all people. And
Mm-hmm.
at least in our field, like in the interest of professional boundaries, like it's already isolating enough, especially if you live in a small town. Like Asheville's not small, but it's small enough. And at least for me, like there's certain like yoga places or meditation places or other thing I might go frequent that I don't frequent anymore because there's clients there, and it's not the same if I'm going to show up for everybody. And so, um, and then if you kind of move into like any kind of leadership role within our field, whether you're a clinical supervisor, group practice owner, your your peer group vastly shrinks really quickly. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's worth considering. And I think one of the things that I didn't really consider and didn't really see until well into my career and its different phases was watching that peer group shrink in terms of who I had access to stay sane. And it takes some effort to kind of really figure out where you're going to find that support.
But
So
we're out here.
yeah, don't do it alone. So
Don't
if
do it.
people want to find you and work with you, or do you all, let me ask this, do you all consult? Like if somebody wanted to have you all come in, or one or both of you come in
Yeah,
to talk to a practice and just cover burnout as a topic and kind of educate people, is that a service you all offer?
absolutely. So the biggest part of we have a big umbrella over this business. My biggest pillar under that umbrella is keynote speaking and training. So that's where actually most of my income comes in, is doing work like that. Anywhere from a small group, I do a lot of dental work, so a small group dental practice to Pepsi. But yes, we absolutely do that. And we're in 2 different parts of the country. So we have short flights to just about anyone that needs us. I fly from Jersey, Sarah flies from Minneapolis, so we can cover the majority of the states in pretty simple time.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Personally, if somebody wanted to work with you one on one, I know probably you're probably like everybody else to where there's different periods you have openings, don't have openings. So it's worth checking. But where would somebody find you if they wanted to seek out your services?
They find both of us at friedtheburnoutpodcast.com.
Got it. And that's also the podcast, which is how I came across you all 6, 8 months ago, and very thankful for that. Um, you all also have a cool thing that I think is a little unique, and maybe it's just because I am so busy, I don't spend as much time cruising groups and things like that. But you'll have open office hours, I think, every week, to where you can anybody like me can join your Facebook group, pop in, ask a question directly, and actually access you all. So I think that's a really unique thing you all offer, is the accessibility. So do you want to talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, well, you mentioned two different things actually. So any listener of Fried the Burnout podcast can come to our Facebook group and interact directly with Cait and I and other people in the community. And you'd be surprised. For a bunch of burnt out people, they are amazing. So if you want some community, if you're feeling alone in your burnout, please don't come to the community and understand you are definitely not alone in your burnout. And then if you want, kind of live Zoom support for more of a discussion, Cait and I are on Zoom every other week. Actually, we do Monday and Tuesday of every other week. So it's 4 times a month, but it's, like I said, every other week. And you can get that link by joining the email newsletter, which is also at friedtheburnoutpodcast.com.
It's one of the few newsletters I'm actually glad I get.
Oh, thank you.
Because so many of them are just like, hey, sign up for this extra thing I just added, and it's absolutely not that. It's great.
No, we spend a lot of time on that. I love the format that we have now. It took me a while to come to it, but we have this is the new podcast. This is what's going on. Here's something that's going on this week. There's always a piece of research that sparked to me. So there's always something related to that week's podcast, some sort of research that supports the thing that we're talking about in that week's show. Then it's maybe something that we are promoting. Maybe it's the group, maybe the resentment journal, maybe something else that we are promoting, and then news, what's coming next. And I have found since I changed to this format that I get such a great amount of positive feedback from people that are like, I can't wait for the newsletter every week. I'm like, oh, thanks, guys.
I even read it. I enjoy reading it.
Yeah.
Because there's only so much time we can talk to each other. So I learn things when I read the newsletter. It makes me smile.
I love it.
Well, cool. And thanks for all the pluggables. Any other key takeaways for people that are still hanging out on the podcast at the end of 45 minutes? And if you're still listening, thanks. But any last little pluggables or takeaways, key takeaways for people?
This is for the empaths. Then we didn't talk about this, but the empaths that are likely, many therapists are empaths, right? I often felt out of control in my empathy. And one of the things I realized is that it was actually hypervigilance that was kind of running the show. And then once I understood that and managed it, I was able to tune into what was actually empathy underneath that. And it's been super useful. So this is, I know it's new, but if any of you are feeling overwhelmed by what you're taking in, whether from your clients or just the world at large, you might be heading towards burnout. And again, just remember, you don't have to do it alone. There's support for you to detangle this for yourself and become a better therapist in the process while taking care of yourself.
Somebody just recently, in kind of compiling a list of resources for people, mentioned a book that kind of specifically addressed being an empath and that, and I can't think of it, but there are resources out there. So I appreciate you touching on that too, because to actually tap into the empathy requires being soft and malleable and flexible versus defensive. And that hypervigilance is, I don't feel safe. Please don't invade my space, and losing the ability to differentiate.
Mm.
Well, cool. This has been great. Everybody that's listening, there'll be links to Cait and Sarah's podcast and resources and Facebook group and stuff. We'll have all that in the show description. Thanks so much for both of you coming on. I highly recommend everybody tune into your podcast, at least for the little nuggets. The format of like, here's a little practical thing you can do in 15 minutes or less and a couple things. And then here's a whole more in-depth deep dive about stuff. I think it's a cool format, so keep it up. Yes. So again, thanks for coming on, and thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having us.
If you love this podcast, please be sure to rate and review. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the publisher, or the guest are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or any other professional information. If you want professional, you should find one.